Scattered across frozen Siberian rail lines, hundreds of Soviet steam locomotives sit exactly where they were placed decades ago. Not scrapped, not preserved in museums, just waiting. By the 1960s, steam was already obsolete. Every other industrialized nation was melting theirs down for scrap. But the Soviet Union quietly kept roughly 1,000 of these machines sealed and greased on hidden reserve sidings, positioned for a war that would render every modern locomotive useless. They called it the Strategic Steam Reserve, a contingency built for nuclear annihilation. It was never activated. And the reason these rusting engines still line Siberia's coldest corridors begins with a question Soviet planners hoped the world would never have to answer. Snow drifts against rows of silent engines, their black hulks stretching for half a mile along the frozen siding. Rust streaks down boiler shells, wheels sunk deep into the permafrost, smokestacks pointed at a sky that rarely sees a train pass. The only footprints here belong to foxes and the occasional scavenger. At first glance, it looks like a graveyard. Hundreds of steam locomotives abandoned in the middle of Siberia, left to rot as if forgotten by time and progress. But the arrangement is too orderly, the lines too straight, the numbers too large to be accidental. These are not the scattered wrecks of a railway in decline. Each locomotive sits in place, sealed and aligned, as if waiting for a signal that never came. The scale of it is almost defiant. Machines built for war and industry, now locked in a kind of suspended animation. The emptiness presses in, raising a question that lingers in the cold air. Why would so many obsolete engines be left here, far from the world's eyes, decades after steam was consigned to history? The answer lies not in neglect, but in a calculation born of fear, a strategy that imagined the end of the world and prepared for what might survive it. Across Siberia, the pattern repeats. Lines of steam locomotives, not clustered in a single graveyard, but distributed in deliberate formations along forgotten sidings and auxiliary tracks. Open source reports and declassified intelligence point to a network, not an accident. A web of storage sites stretching from the Urals to the outskirts of Irkutsk and Novosibirsk. Satellite readings from the last decade confirm the scale. Hundreds of engines arranged in parallel rows. Each one sealed and aligned as if waiting for inspection. The reserve lines follow the logic of movement, not abandonment. Sidings run parallel to main routes, often near coal depots or water towers. Their placement echoing the demands of wartime logistics. The spacing between engines, the maintenance of access tracks, even the proximity to major freight corridors, all suggest a system designed for rapid reactivation, not for scrapping. At Taishet, Krasnoyarsk East, and along the Baikal-Amur main line, inventories from the 1970s list dozens of locomotives marked as in reserve. Some sites, like Shumkovo, held as many as 140 engines at their peak. Others, hidden deeper in the taiga, show up only as faint lines on satellite images, rows of steel bodies preserved far from prying eyes. The sheer number and distribution of these engines defies any explanation rooted in neglect. This is not the random scatter of obsolete machinery, but the fingerprint of a state-level plan. The question grows larger. What kind of threat would drive a superpower to scatter its last steam locomotives across miles and thousands of kilometers, maintaining them as if the future depended on their survival? By the early 1960s, the rest of the industrial world had turned its back on steam. In Western Europe and North America, locomotives that once hauled armies and freight across continents were being cut up for scrap or polished for display in museums. Diesel and electric traction promised greater efficiency, fewer workers, and a future free from the smoke and grime of the past. Soviet planners, too, had embraced modernization on paper, officially ending new steam production and converting main lines to electric power. Yet here, in the icy emptiness of Siberia. The old technology was not just tolerated, but methodically preserved. Rows of engines, some built before World War II, remained in storage years after their supposed retirement, maintained at state expense while their counterparts elsewhere vanished. To an outsider, the scene defies logic. Why would a superpower, obsessed with progress and industrial might, keep hundreds of steam engines in working order long after their time had passed? Was the Soviet Union simply behind the times, clinging to outdated machines while the West surged ahead? Or did these hulks serve a purpose that modern technology could not fulfill? The contrast is sharp. While other nations celebrated the end of steam as a triumph of progress, the Soviet rail state quietly assembled a hidden stockpile, treating obsolescence as a strategic asset. What appears at first as waste or inertia is, in fact, a deliberate act, a hedge against a future no one wanted to imagine. The mystery deepens. What threat could make a government treat yesterday's technology as tomorrow's last hope? The answer to the riddle of Siberia's silent steam fleet begins with a single unyielding fact. These locomotives were not left behind by accident. They were stored, cataloged, and guarded as part of a deliberate emergency reserve. This was no museum, no dumping ground for relics. The sidings themselves were built as storage bases, woven into the fabric of Cold War contingency plans. In the archives of the Ministry of Railways and the shadowy corridors of military planning, steam was treated as a strategic resource, obsolete for daily use, but essential in the event of total war. Declassified intelligence references and open-source reporting converge on the same conclusion. Soviet planners, haunted by the specter of nuclear conflict, saw modern railways as vulnerable. Electric and diesel locomotives, the pride of post-war progress, could be crippled by electromagnetic pulse or by a sudden loss of refined fuel. Steam, with its coal-fired boilers and mechanical simplicity, became the fallback. Documents from the late 1960s point to official instructions for the creation of steam locomotive storage bases along the Trans-Siberian corridor. These were not ordinary depots. They were designed to keep engines isolated, maintained, and ready for reactivation if disaster struck. The Ministry of Railways, working in concert with the Ministry of Defense, allocated budgets, assigned inspection teams, and mapped out the distribution of reserves. Sidings near Taishet, Krasnoyarsk East, and Shumkovo all appear in inventories as in reserve, a bureaucratic label that carried the weight of national survival. American intelligence, always searching for Soviet weak points, noted the existence of a double-track steam line running east from Novosibirsk, set apart from the electrified main. Satellite images decades later would confirm the presence of these hidden fleets, arranged with military precision. Within the Soviet planning world, the logic was cold and clear. If the worst happened, if nuclear war shattered the grid and fuel lines, steam could outlast the blast. The sidings were not a sign of backwardness, but of ruthless calculation. What looked like decay was for a time a hedge against the end of civilization. The irony lingers. Engines preserved to survive a world-ending war now left to rust, monuments to a strategy that was never called upon. The answer is not neglect, but intent. An intent shaped by the brutal arithmetic of survival in the nuclear age. The logic behind Siberia's silent steam fleet rests on a threat that haunted Cold War planners: electromagnetic pulse. In the event of a nuclear detonation, a single high-altitude blast could unleash a wave of electromagnetic energy powerful enough to cripple modern infrastructure in seconds. US and Soviet studies from the 1960s and the 1970s warned that an electromagnetic pulse could generate electric fields tens of thousands of volts per meter, enough to fry the delicate circuits inside diesel-electric locomotives. Traction motors, control relays, and solid-state electronics, all the systems that made modern trains efficient, could be destroyed in an instant, leaving even the newest engines as nothing more than dead weight on the tracks. Soviet planners took these warnings seriously. Technical bulletins and Western intelligence reports both pointed to the same vulnerability. The more advanced the railway, the more likely it was to fail in the chaos after a nuclear strike. Diesel electrics, the pride of post-war progress, depended on a web of electronic relays and sensors. Electric locomotives, tied to the national grid, were even more exposed. In contrast, the steam locomotive was almost immune. Its operation depended on fire, water, and a web of rods and pistons, mechanical, not electronic. No circuit boards, no transistors, no reliance on external power. As long as there was coal or wood and someone to stoke the fire, a steam engine could move freight through a world where every digital system had gone dark. The Ministry of Railways, advised by military engineers and physicists, weighed these facts with a kind of ruthless clarity. If war came and the grid went down, the only trains that could be counted on were those that belonged to the past. This was not nostalgia. It was a calculation shaped by hard science and the grim arithmetic of survival. Steam was preserved not because it was old, but because it was simple, robust, and, in the eyes of planners, nearly indestructible. In the shadow of nuclear war, the obsolete became the ultimate insurance policy. The irony is stark. The same engines once dismissed as relics were quietly recast as the last hope for movement in a world stripped of modernity. Coal and wood, stacked in silent heaps beside the reserve lines, formed the second backbone of the Soviet steam reserve. Where modern locomotives depended on refined diesel or a live electric grid, steam engines could burn whatever was at hand: lignite from the Kuznetsk Basin, firewood from the endless taiga. Soviet planners saw this as a lifeline for a shattered wartime economy. In a crisis, oil refineries and fuel depots would be prime targets, and the sprawling network of pipelines and tankers that kept diesel trains running could be cut off in a single night. But coal lay buried under Siberia's frozen ground in seams that stretched for hundreds of kilometers, and wood could be felled wherever the rails ran. Documents from the Ministry of Railways show that reserve sites were chosen for their proximity to these resources. Sidings were built close to coal depots and water towers, with enough stockpiled fuel to last through weeks of emergency operation. The logic was grimly practical. In the chaos after a nuclear strike, supply chains would break down, refineries might burn, and trucks could vanish from the roads. Only what could be sourced locally, mined, chopped, hauled by hand, would be available. Steam locomotives, with their voracious fireboxes, could be fed from whatever the land provided. This was not a system designed for peacetime efficiency, but for survival under siege. The reserve was built to keep trains moving when every other link in the logistics chain had failed. In the arithmetic of total war, reliability meant independence from fragile, centralized fuel networks. The same engines once dismissed as wasteful relics were transformed into the last hope for moving coal, grain, soldiers, and supplies across a continent in ruins. The irony lingers: machines built for abundance, repurposed for a world of desperate scarcity. Inside the reserve bases, the logic of survival played out in grease, ledgers, and routine. Engines were not simply parked and forgotten. Each locomotive entered a cycle of preservation, a process as methodical as any military drill. Boilers were drained of water to prevent freezing and corrosion. The fireboxes and tubes received a coating of protective oil, while every bearing and joint was packed with grease. Openings were sealed with tarpaulins, and desiccant packs were tucked inside the cabs to keep Siberian damp at bay. Tar seals, waxed journals, and oiled rods became the armor against time. Depot foremen kept thick logbooks, recording each step, date of last drainage, status of seals, and condition of lubricants. Every 6 months, crews rotated the wheels, sometimes moving an entire row of engines a few meters down the siding to prevent flat spots and seized bearings. Quarterly, a cold start drill brought select locomotives briefly to life. Fire was lit, pressure raised, valves checked, then the engines cooled and returned to silence. The schedule was relentless, the discipline unbending. Even in deep winter, when the temperature dropped below -30, workers trudged through snow to inspect gaskets and test the integrity of the seals. The infrastructure behind this effort was substantial. Coal bunkers and water towers stood ready beside the reserve lines. Spare parts warehouses held boiler tubes, gaskets, and tools. Some bases, like Shumkovo, operated under formal orders issued in 1967, establishing them as permanent anchors in the emergency network. The presence of these bases is not a matter of legend, but of institutional record, each with its own staff, maintenance logs, and budget line. Mechanics and inspectors, many now anonymous, left their mark in pencil and grease, ensuring that these engines could be brought back to life within days if the order ever came. The reserve was a living system, not a static pile of scrap. Its survival depended on human vigilance as much as on steel and oil. For decades, the routine was maintained with a kind of quiet pride, an invisible army of workers keeping the last hope of movement ready for a world that, mercifully, never arrived. Siberia was not chosen by chance. Its sheer size and remoteness offered a kind of natural armor, placing the reserve lines far beyond the reach of any first-wave nuclear strike aimed at Moscow or the industrial West. Maps from the era show how these sidings snake along the Trans-Siberian corridor, threading through forests and marshes, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest city. Geography became strategy. The farther the engines were from likely targets, the better their odds of surviving the initial chaos. Dispersal was key. Instead of concentrating the reserve in a single depot, planners scattered the locomotives across dozens of sites: Taishet, Krasnoyarsk East, Shumkovo, and others, each tucked beside existing infrastructure but hidden from easy view. This web of storage meant that no single attack could wipe out the reserve. Declassified CIA intelligence even notes a dedicated double-track steam line running east from Novosibirsk, built specifically to keep the fallback fleet operational if the electrified main lines were lost. The landscape itself became a shield, and the reserve's survival depended as much on Siberia's emptiness as on steel and coal. In this logic, the land was not a backdrop, but the main defense, an expanse vast enough to hide a second chance for movement when the rest of the world might stand still. On the western side of the Iron Curtain, the end of steam was a matter of progress and pride. By the mid-1960s, British railways had staged farewell runs, American railroads auctioned off their last iron giants, and Germany's once mighty steam fleet was reduced to a handful of museum pieces, scrap yards filled with cut-up locomotives, and a new generation of diesel and electric trains took over the main lines. In the United Kingdom, rumors of a secret steam reserve persisted for years, but the reality was far more mundane. Preservation fell to hobbyists and heritage railways, not the state. The old engines became relics, their value measured in nostalgia and tourism, not national security. The Soviet Union, facing the same technological crossroads, made a radically different choice. Steam was not simply retired, it was reclassified as a strategic asset. The same machines scrapped or displayed in the West were hidden away in Siberia, assigned a new purpose by planners who saw disaster not as a distant memory, but as a looming possibility. Where Western railroads calculated efficiency, Soviet doctrine calculated survivability. A locomotive that could burn coal or wood, run without electronics, and be repaired with basic tools was not obsolete. It was insurance against the unimaginable. This divide was rooted in more than just engineering. Western governments saw railways as economic engines, optimized for peace and profit. In Moscow, the railway was a weapon and a lifeline, its fate decided in the shadow of nuclear strategy. The decision to keep hundreds of steam engines in reserve was not a quirk of nostalgia or bureaucratic inertia. It was a reflection of a security culture shaped by siege, scarcity, and the constant rehearsal of catastrophe. The same technology, judged by different doctrines, became either scrap or salvation. In this contrast, the Cold War's logic is laid bare. What one side discarded as obsolete, the other guarded as a last line of defense. No order ever came. For all the drills, for every inspection logged in pencil and grease, the reserve lines never roared back to life for the catastrophe they were built to survive. Not a single locomotive was called to duty in a nuclear emergency. The engines remained silent, their readiness measured only in theory, never in the chaos of real war. On paper, the system promised a fallback, hundreds of steam locomotives scattered across the Siberian wilds, waiting for the moment when modern railways might be reduced to dead metal by a nuclear blast or an electromagnetic pulse. Official doctrine claimed these machines could be made ready within 48 hours. Crews summoned, boilers filled, coal loaded, and the whole fleet pressed into service to haul the essentials of survival across a ruined continent. But the cracks in this confidence were always there, just beneath the surface. Every step in the reactivation chain depended on people, trained firemen and engineers, many of whom had retired or moved away as steam faded from daily use. Certification lapsed, skills atrophied, and the pool of reserve crews shrank with each passing year. Spare parts, boiler tubes, gaskets, lubricants were stockpiled, but the longer the engine sat, the more unpredictable their condition became. Cold start drills, when they happened, involved only a handful of locomotives at a time, never the full fleet. The idea that hundreds could be brought to life on short notice was never tested outside of carefully managed exercises, and even those are shrouded in secrecy and doubt. The gap between doctrine and reality widened with time. Maintenance routines were followed, but always against a backdrop of uncertainty. Would the seals hold after decades in the cold? Would the axles turn? Or would bearings seize? Would the men who knew these machines still be available? Or would the knowledge die with them? The reserve became a kind of insurance policy that was never cashed in, its value unproven and its promises untested. Soviet planners, so methodical in their preparations, became almost tragic figures, guardians of a strategy that would never see its trial by fire. The confidence of the Cold War era, the belief in control and readiness, now lingers as a quiet irony. A fleet preserved for a war that never came, left to rust on the edge of memory. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist in December 1991, the system that had kept the reserve alive vanished almost overnight. The Ministry of Railways dissolved, its budgets evaporated, and the web of orders, inspections, and routine maintenance that once animated the sidings fell silent. The cold logic of contingency planning gave way to the chaos of transition. Without funding, the cycles of preservation stopped. Boilers were no longer drained, grease hardened in bearings, and seals on cabs and fireboxes cracked in the freeze-thaw of Siberian seasons. Where teams of inspectors once logged every detail in thick ledgers, now only the wind moved between the rows. By the mid-1990s, the reserve had become a relic in every sense. With no staff to oversee the sites, the engines began to deteriorate. Paint flaked, rust spread across boiler shells, and water seeped into every seam. Cannibalization replaced maintenance. Locals and scavengers stripped copper, brass, and anything that could be sold for scrap. At Shumkovo, where 140 locomotives once sat under careful watch, rows thinned as engines were cut up and hauled away for metal. The same story played out at Taishet, Krasnoyarsk East, and the lesser-known sidings along the Baikal-Amur main line. The infrastructure that had supported the reserve, coal bunkers, water towers, parts warehouses, was abandoned or dismantled. Without the institutional machinery of the Soviet state, there was no one left to care for the engines or justify their existence. Russian railways, inheriting the assets, faced its own financial crisis and prioritized survival over preservation. Official orders to scrap locomotives circulated quietly, and the reserve's fate was sealed not by a single decision, but by 1,000 small acts of neglect and necessity. What had been a system, planned, funded, and guarded, became a field of orphans. The sidings, once symbols of readiness, now bore silent witness to the end of both an era and an idea. The reserve lines did not fade all at once. They unraveled, engine by engine, as the old depot world receded into memory. In the absence of purpose, the machines built for survival became monuments to abandonment, their iron bodies rusting into the landscape they were meant to conquer. A new kind of attention found the reserve lines not through official records, but through the lenses of explorers and the reach of the internet. By the early 2000s, rail photographers and urban explorers began to document the rusting rows at Shumkovo and Taishet, posting images of skeletal engines and frostbitten sidings onto forums and blogs. What had once been a state secret, hidden in the depths of Siberia, became a visual phenomenon, shared, debated, and dissected by a global audience. Satellite images, once the domain of intelligence agencies, now circulated on Reddit and enthusiast sites, showing the unmistakable outlines of steam engines lined up in the snow. The story shifted almost overnight. Instead of a forgotten relic, the reserve became a fascination for rail fans and historians alike, its existence confirmed not by declassified documents, but by the unmistakable evidence of Google Earth and the testimony of those who braved the journey to see it firsthand. Photographers like Pavel Raspopov captured the eerie symmetry of the lines, the faded red stars on boiler fronts, and the slow encroachment of birch and pine. Their images traveled far beyond Russia, sparking new questions about the fate of these engines and the motives behind their preservation. The reserve lines, once invisible by design, entered the digital age as a kind of ghost infrastructure, part Cold War artifact, part internet legend. The meaning of the locomotives changed in the public eye, no longer just tools of contingency planning, but symbols of a vanished era. Their purpose and their decay, now open to anyone with a connection and curiosity. The secret had become a spectacle, and the question shifted from why they were kept to what should become of them now. Not every locomotive met the same fate. As the decades passed and the world changed around them, the reserve engines scattered across Siberia diverged into three distinct paths: scrapped, preserved, or left in limbo. At Shumkovo, dozens of L-class Lebedyanki still rust beneath open skies, their numbers thinned by years of scavenging and quiet dismantling. Local scrap merchants, driven by the rising price of metals, cut up rows of engines for salvage. Official orders to scrap came quietly, with little ceremony, as Russian railways faced mounting financial pressure and no longer had reason to maintain a fleet built for a war that never came. Yet not all were lost to the torch. A handful of locomotives escaped the graveyard through the efforts of regional museums and preservation groups. The Patikovo Museum in Perm region and the Russian Railway Museum in St. Petersburg now display ex-reserve engines, some restored to working order, others standing as static exhibits. These survivors owe their existence to a mix of local pride, historical curiosity, and the determination of volunteers who saw value in saving a piece of Cold War history. The process was rarely straightforward. Negotiations with Russian railways dragged on, complicated by unclear ownership and the absence of any official transfer policy. Many locomotives remained in legal limbo, neither fully abandoned nor formally preserved, their status unresolved as budgets shifted and priorities changed. Heritage advocates and scrappers often found themselves at odds, each claiming a different right to the iron carcasses. For every engine rescued, others disappeared into the market for scrap, their stories ending without record. The question of what deserves saving, who decides, and on what grounds remains unsettled. In the end, the fate of the Soviet steam reserve is as fragmented as the country that built it. Some engines reborn as artifacts, some reduced to raw material, and many left stranded between memory and oblivion. What endures along the reserve lines is not just rusted metal, but the imprint of an era ruled by the logic of catastrophe. These locomotives, lined up in the frozen silence of Siberia, are more than abandoned technology. They are the physical residue of a nation's readiness for the unimaginable. Every boiler shell and faded serial number preserves the mindset of Cold War planners who believed survival could be engineered, even in the aftermath of nuclear fire. Here, the Soviet state reveals itself not through monuments of victory, but through the quiet tenacity of its preparations for defeat. The engines stand as monuments to a superpower's willingness to outlast disaster at any cost. Their presence, scattered across the taiga, speaks to a vision of resilience measured in coal bunkers and sealed bearings, not in parades or official speeches. The reserve was a bet on endurance, rooted in the belief that the simplest machines might be the last ones left running if the world fell apart. This was industrial history repurposed for the endgame, a strategy that valued redundancy over progress and preparedness over efficiency. Now, as the paint peels and the steel sags under decades of weather, their meaning has shifted. What was once a hidden arsenal is now a visible paradox. Engines built for survival, preserved for a war that never came, left to decay in a landscape that outlived their purpose. The irony is inescapable. The Soviet state, so determined to control every outcome, left behind a graveyard of machines that outlasted the system itself. In their ruins, the logic of the nuclear age remains on display. History made visible in rust, a warning and a memorial, all at once. Today, these silent engines outlast the empire that once stockpiled them, monuments to both paranoia and foresight. As modern infrastructure grows more complex and vulnerable, their rusting hulks warn against assuming progress always means security. The line between future-proof and obsolete is never clear in real time. In the end, the only war these locomotives fought was against time itself. What do you see when you look at them? Waste, wisdom, or something in between?